Ephesians chapter 3, we finally arrived, but we're still in the first half of Ephesians. And I want to highlight a couple of verses in particular. I'm going to start with verse 7. Verse 7 says, I have become a servant of this gospel by the power of God's grace given me through the working of his power. There is so much in that single verse right there to focus on. Servant of the gospel by the gift of God's grace given me through the power working in me. His power working in me. The reality is, for every single one of us, we have been called to live a life of significance in service. Now understand that, significance in service. Let me give you an example of this. Two young children growing up in the late 1800s in London, England. They lived a comfortable life. Their parents were well educated. They weren't rich, but they weren't in need. And these two children were starting to decide what they wanted to do with their lives, their career choice. So their parents gave them an interesting gift. They took them into the inner city of London. Not to the business district, but just a couple of blocks away in a very notorious area called Whitechapel, where the living conditions were absolutely horrific. And they took these two young children into this area. Perhaps they were inspired by the writings of a journalist called Henry Mayhew. His articles were written to expose the horrid living conditions for the people who were living in these communities. And this area was only literally a couple of blocks from the biggest business district in London. And the interesting thing about that is that the people who ran these business districts owned the tenements where these folks lived in, and were responsible for an awful lot of the suffering that they had to endure. And so these two parents took their young children down to this terrible, terrible area. And this is what they said to them. These are our neighbors. These are our neighbors. And as a result of this, the young boy dedicated his life to continue to expose the conditions of the poor and to help those living in these areas. And the young girl dedicated her life to serving overseas in the missions, working in hospitals and orphanages. They never became, according to this world's standards, successful. However, they said they found personal fulfillment and significance in serving God by serving others. Now this reality is open to all of us. There are all sorts of ways of serving God. It's not just professionals who are called to serve God. It's all of us. Once we become a Christian, we are called to serve God. But there's some things that we have to understand about that. Now when I'm talking about serving God, I'm talking about serving God not only in the grandiose things, but in the everyday things. For example, in Ephesians chapter 5, we're going to see how husbands and wives are there to serve each other, to bless and encourage each other. We see in Proverbs chapter 22 and verse 6 how all of us take a part in helping young people to grow and to develop. It doesn't say parents, it says train up a child. And then Paul speaks about this extensively in many of his letters. For example, in Galatians chapter 5 and 13, where he talks about how we should serve one another humbly in love. And then Peter talks about this as well too. 1 Peter chapter 4 verse 10, where he says that we are to serve others using whatever gifts that God has given us as faithful stewards of God's grace. God's grace. And even Jesus, when he was here on earth, he talked about this. But he not only talked about it, he lived it. He lived the example of serving others. But in Mark chapter 10 in particular, verse 41, he says, even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So you see this, that the Bible is full of teachings about how all of us have been called into service. And this idea of service applies broadly, like I said. It applies in the family, it applies in our relationships with one another, it applies in the church, it also applies in business. I've been reading a book I just started the other day, and I found this book fascinating. This is a book about management. Some of you might think, why would I still be reading management books at my age? But I can't help myself. I see a good book, I have to buy it. And the book about management, you know what the title of this book is? Love Works. And the book is teaching management's principles based upon 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And the author of this book says it works. And he goes on to give a lot of different instructions. So I'm reading this book, and one of the things that struck me about this book is how the company started up a fund. And they asked employees to contribute a little bit, but they top it up. And what they do is the managers have to go and they have to connect with the employees. How are you doing today? What's going on? Just talk with them. And they have to go and work alongside with them. So you get the manager leaving his office and going and cleaning the streets in the middle of the morning as the parks get ready to receive people and chatting with them. And he said that, the director said that over the last few years, they've been able to help over 1,000 employees through grants to help them in their life situations and to help organize to get them the help that they need. And he said that is our role as management, is to work with our staff so we're one big family. It sounds kind of idealistic, but they make it work. And according to what I read, aside from the book, this company has the highest employee satisfaction rating in the United States. And their values and principles are based upon 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And one of their sites, they run amusement parks. One of their sites is the Silver Dollar Amusement Park. It is rated as the #1 amusement park in the United States, above Disney, because they follow biblical principles. One applicant stated, I want to work for your company so much that I will keep applying until you hire me. They won't give up. It's because they're treating their staff by following biblical principles. Now Paul speaks about, when he talks about serving others, he talks about the dignity of service. Now this is kind of a neat thing to put together when you consider all the other things that Paul talks about when he talks about service. But he talks about the dignity of service. You see, he had been given the responsibility of sharing the good news with the non-Jewish people. He was a missionary to the non-Jewish people, and he considered this a privilege. He considered it a privilege, even though it brought him a lot of problems. And that was the reality. Right up to the point where it took his life. But he considered it a pretty privilege. One theologian put it this way here. Paul saw service, even imprisonment, as a joyful privilege. Doesn't make sense when we think about it on the surface, but that's the way he viewed it. There's a legend I read a few days ago about how the knights of the Round Table, you know, King Arthur and the Round Table, and how the knights would approach the king and they would ask for dangers to face and dragons to slay, because they wanted to do whatever service they could for their king. The dignity of service, the privilege, the joyful privilege of service. understand this, that being in service to Jesus, it's not a penalty. You know, people shouldn't come up to you and go, well, what did you do to deserve this? No, it's not a penalty. It's a privilege instead. And to suffer for the sake of Jesus, and to suffer for the sake of sharing the good news is an opportunity to show God's love to other people. As a matter of fact, the greatest testimony is not our faithfulness in the good times and the fair times when everything is going well. It's our faithfulness in the struggles, in the difficult times, in the challenging times. Now here's a couple of important principles I'd like to share with you. And I'll share a few more than these, but here's a couple that I'll share with you. Number one is, you can understand where I'm coming from. The first principle is, serving is a privilege. And the second one is this, and the second one is extremely important. We are significant in service when we use the right equipment, the right tools. Okay, you're wondering about that? Let's continue on. See, I kind of like the statement, the right tool for the right job. I think Canadian Tire came up with that, as they were showing the array of all of the tools that they had available for that person that has to have every single one of them in their garage. I remember talking to one tradesperson as he was putting something in, and he grabbed a screwdriver when he needed a hammer, and he started hitting this. And I said, the right tool? And he said, yeah, the right tool is the right tool beside me. But let's think about that for a second, okay? The other day I was wearing a suit, and when I put the suit on, 2 buttons fell off. Now they didn't fall off because the suit was too tight, they just fell off. Now I want you to think about this, and you can help me with this. Should I go into my garage and grab a hammer and a chisel to fix my suit? Do you think that would work best? Maybe I should get something like a needle and thread. Alan say no.
Does that hurt? Can you fix this, please?
Ask somebody else. Or how about this? Say I want to put on a door. I want to install a door. Phil, you can help me with this one here. Should I grab a needle and thread? Okay, you think that'd be a good idea. Or maybe I should get like a brad nailer, a level, a router, some shims. You notice I'm getting ready for that project because I'm installing one. And in case my list is incomplete, you can help me out with that, okay? What would work best? It's having the right tools for the job. So the first tool that we need in our toolkit to be able to serve God effectively with significance is the tool of grace. The tool of grace. God's grace that has been given to us and that we give it to other people. Here's a couple of thoughts around that. We are motivated more effectively by grace than by guilt. Yet guilt has been used for years to motivate people. Ephesians chapter 3 verse 2 says, "Surely you have heard about the administration of God's grace that has been given to me." He's the administrator, the manager of what? Grace. Now I know, as many people do, that guilt can be a powerful motivator and has been used many, many times over the years, continues to be used, and I would say, sadly, that I have used that at times. But guilt is also a terrible motivator. Let me give you this example. Joel was the vice president of Saab North America. And he stated that when he took over Saab in North America, the company had posted a $50 million deficit. And within 2 years, he said his team had turned it around, so the company was now posting a profit of $10 million. And then he said in our 3rd year, there was a 20% reduction in profit. Now understand this, a reduction in profit. They made $8 million, but there was a 20% reduction. And he said the moment that the earnings were posted, he got an email from the CEO of South, berating him and demanding that he show up in 2 days at a board meeting in Sweden. So Joel said, the company paid $10,000 for me to jump on a plane, go over to Sweden, paid for my accommodations. He said, I went to the board of directors meetings where the berating continued, only this time it was public humiliation. And he said, I sat there and I endured this. Let me ask you this question. How effective do you think this performance evaluation was? Well, this is what Joel said. From that moment on, he said, I disconnected myself from the company. He said, I didn't bring up the fact that I wasn't getting all the supplies that I need, that our inventory was constantly low. But he said, I completely disconnected from the company, and shortly after, I quit. That's how effective it is. You see, guilt doesn't motivate us to greater things. Instead, it makes us feel bad. You see, guilt points out the flaws, focuses in on the flaws, and makes us feel like we're flawed. I'm a bad person. It also encourages the negative. It encourages the negative activities. Let me give you an example of this, okay? So this person had been on a diet for 3 months, and they had lost weight. And they were getting together with friends, and they decided to celebrate, and so they went out and bought a cake to celebrate with their friends. They brought the cake home, they looked at the cake sitting on the shelf, the cake looked delicious, and they decided, I've been so good, I'm going to have a little piece of cake. So they had a little piece of cake. Well, you know what happens when you have one piece of cake and it's so good and it's sitting there and you're looking at it. What do you think they did? They had another piece of cake. Now they started to feel guilty. So they had another, and anyways, there was a half cake gone after 3 months of dieting. And their guilt intensified. So what do you think they did? Do you think they threw the cake out? No. They ate the entire cake. Guilt encourages the negative activity. That's what happens. Paul said, the good that I would do, I do not, but the bad that I do not want, that I do. Guilt encourages the negative. But here's a thought about that. Some people, now listen to the wording of this, some people would rather use the power of guilt over others than to let God motivate them by grace. You get that? You see, there's power when we berate somebody else. There's power when we use their actions against them. We have power. But is it a positive power? Instead of using or letting God motivate by grace. We do far better when we feel confident, when we feel competent, when we feel content. You see, that's how God motivates us. He motivates us through grace. Let me give you a few examples. God reminded Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9. He says, my grace is all you need. For my power works best in your weakness. So he's saying right there, don't worry. I'm going to work with you and I'm going to help you. And there's a quote I'd like to share with you. Grace means that all of our mistakes now serve a purpose instead of serving shame. All of our mistakes now serve a purpose instead of serving shame. That's grace. St. Augustine stated this, for grace is given not because we have done good works, but in order that we may be able to do good works. See, God motivates and grace enables. Philip Yancey stated, and I like this one here too. I like them all. But this one here, he said, grace like water flows to the lowest part. So if you're feeling really, 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 really down, guess what? God's grace will get down there too. Isn't that wonderful? And then Max Lucado. I always love reading Max Lucado because he's such a nice person to read. He puts things so beautifully. So listen to what he says about it. Grace is God's best idea. His decision to ravage people by love to rescue passionately, and to restore justly. What rivals it? Of all his wondrous works, grace, in my estimation, is the magnum opus, the masterpiece. That's how important and valuable grace is. So grace motivates, but then God energizes. That's the second tool. Again, verse 7. I became a servant of this gospel by the gift of God's grace given to me through the working of his power. The second is just as necessary as the first. I need God's power in my life. Let me tell you, when I was younger, I used to play with firecrackers. Anybody else ever played with a firecracker? A few. Firecrackers look like a little tiny stick of dynamite. Now, let's not make a mistake in thinking that they're not dangerous, because they are dangerous. There have been many people who have been injured by misusing firecrackers. But in saying that, the effect of a firecracker as opposed to a stick of dynamite is significantly different. Now, there is something called the BDE, which is the blast damage estimate. So the BDE for a firecracker is a little tiny mound, I don't want to tell this also, but an anthill, or a fruit. That's the estimate of damage. A stick of dynamite, one stick of dynamite can extensively damage a brick house. That's a big difference, right? Well, trying to do God's work in our strength is like a firecracker. In verse 20, now listen to this. Now him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we could ask or imagine, according to his power that is at work within us. You get it? So don't play with firecrackers. And don't try to do God's work without God's power. Paul reminds us we can, and listen to the word here, be dynamically changed and empowered by God. See, a number of years ago I made that decision that I was going to do God's work, live for God. I was going to do what he asked me to do. I was going to show other people through my life and through my attitudes and through my actions God's love. The problem was I was trying to do this in my own strength. And you know what? It didn't work. But then I learned about God's grace and allowed God to work in my life. And then God enabled me to do so much more than I could ever dream. The right tool for the right job. Using God's power and God's grace. Now that brings me to my third tool for the day. And that is, and you got your toolbox open, I hope you can receive another tool. Humility. And some of you guys are going, I wanted a chainsaw. Humility is the third tool. Doesn't it make sense when you say servant and humble at the same time? Servant and humble at the same time. In verse 8, Paul says, although I am less than the least of all God's people, this grace was given to me to preach to the Gentiles the unsearchable riches of God's grace. So you hear that, his words. I am the less of the least of God's people. And this sort of a theme repeats itself over and over again. To the Corinthians, he says this in 1 Corinthians 15. I am the least of the apostles, and do not even deserve to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But then he adds this, but by the grace of God, I am what I am. Did you hear that? By the grace of God, I am what I am. And again, to Timothy, he says this, here is a trustworthy saying that deserves full acceptance. Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom you are the worst. Did he say that? Am I wrong?
I think she does.
What did he say? Come on, help me out.
I am the worst.
That's what Paul said about himself. I am the worst. So you see this over and over again repeated, this thought. He realized that without Christ I am nothing. He had no problems admitting he was the least and that he needed Jesus. He needed Jesus. And without Jesus, he'd learned that valuable lesson. You see, before he was a Pharisee, and he thought, I know everything I need to know to follow God and to teach others. That's what he thought. I know all I need to know to follow God and to teach others. I like this statement. It came from Albert Einstein. We've heard of Albert Einstein. He was a theoretical physicist. He is considered to be the most influential scientist of all time. And yet he stated this: the more I know, the more I realize how much I don't know. Mm-hmm. You know, that's a learning paradox, isn't it? The more I know, the less I know. And Paul understood that when he really encountered God through Jesus. And he stated this, and I love this statement here in 1 Corinthians 8 and 2. He says, anyone who claims to know all the answers doesn't really know very much.
Yeah.
See, Paul had rejected Jesus' teachings. He had been persecuting all of those people who decided to follow Jesus. And yet, by God's grace, he is made an apostle. Not by merit, and he acknowledges that. Not by merit, but by God's grace, he's made an apostle. So I want to share something with you. You probably already are aware of this, but you know that originally Paul was called Saul.
Yeah. Now
Now the name Saul, and all of these names have meaning, the name Saul in the Jewish language meant, get this, asked for. Now what a title to have as a name. You're asked for, you're sought after. People are waiting to hear from you. You're important. And then he was given the name Paul. Now in the Roman language, Paul means little. He went from asked for to little. And when he was approaching people who were Romans, they're looking at him and go, what's your name? I'm Paul. Yeah, right. That's pretty small, pretty insignificant. Why am I going to listen to you? Well, you're not listening to me, you're saying you're listening to God. I am little. You know that old chorus, I am weak, but thou art strong? Jesus, keep me from all wrong. I am satisfied as long as I walk, dear Lord, close to you. You think about it now. Some of the other names that people received in the Bible. What are some of the other names? Abraham. He was given the name Abraham. You know what Abraham means? It means the father of a nation. It also means God is exalted. What a wonderful name. You walk in, I'm Abraham. It goes, wow. Or how about Jacob? Jacob became Israel, which is the name of the nation of Israel. Or Peter. He went from Simon to Peter, who was called a rock. And Paul went from asked for to little. You see, God knew exactly what he was doing. God knew what he was doing in Paul's life. And God knew that he was going to take Paul and turn him right around, and he was going to do great things through Paul, in Paul. And Paul said yes. And Paul would say to people, follow me as I follow Jesus. And see, the two go together. Follow me as I follow Jesus. Paul had this beautiful balance in his life of humility. And that's the final tool that we need. But like I said, a beautiful balance, because when humility is mixed with grace and love, it comes out beautifully. Because when we are in God's grace, we find this sense of contentment. Paul said, in all things I've learned to be content. And we find that we have a confidence because we're trusting in God, and he's leading us and he's enabling us. So we have all these things we need as we humbly choose to follow God. I am little, but he is great. And he is the one that I want to reveal to you.